Hello to friends, family, or anyone else who's happened upon this podcast. Though you probably know me already, I'll introduce myself anyway. My name is Emma Rossiter. I'm a fourth-year honors history student at McGill University with a minor in Indigenous Studies. This podcast is essentially my capstone project for my Indigenous Studies minor. It's what's called a knowledge mobilization project, and the intention behind it is having us students share with our communities some of the knowledge we've learned in this program. I've done a lot of reading for my Indigenous Studies minor, and many of the things I've read can be difficult to access if you're not in an academic institution. I also know that it can be hard to know where to start if you want to learn about Indigenous issues and you don't have much prior knowledge, so what I hope to do with this project is help other settlers understand Canadian colonialism a bit better by looking at one very important topic, and that is the child welfare system. By looking at the experiences of Indigenous children in the system over the past 60 years or so, we can get a sense of the challenges Indigenous nations face today, in addition to the ways the Canadian government intervenes in and controls Indigenous lives. Child welfare is a very intimate arena of control that has huge implications for the overall health and strength of Indigenous nations. Many of us are aware of this, of course, in the historical context of residential schools, which are now thankfully being taught about in public school curricula across Canada. But what many people don't realize is that Indigenous children are still taken away from their families and nations at alarming rates. And while residential schools no longer exist, the child welfare system continues to perpetuate many of the same harms that those schools did. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about the history of Indigenous child welfare and apprehension in Canada, starting with a brief discussion of residential schools, and then a discussion of how the child welfare system gradually replaced those schools in what is now known as the 60s scoop, and how this 60s scoop in turn morphed over time into what many people call the millennial scoop. I'll then look at the causes of the present-day overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the system and what they can tell us about Canadian settler colonialism and systemic racism, in addition to the range of problems within the system that make it so dangerous for Indigenous children. I'll also go over a case heard in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal resulting in a ruling that the Government of Canada racially discriminates against Indigenous children in its delivery of child welfare services. And finally, I'll look at what needs to be done to fix this injustice, what programs could replace the existing foster care system, what bigger systemic changes need to be made, and what settlers and allies can do to help. A few disclaimers before we begin. Firstly, I'm not a social work or law student, so the information I'm giving you will be a bit more big picture and not as much about the technical nuts and bolts of child welfare or about specific legislation. And secondly, I'm a settler, so while I hope this podcast can be a jumping off point into learning more about Indigenous child welfare, particularly for other settlers, my voice should never be the only one you listen to about these matters. Please seek out Indigenous perspectives because they do justice to this issue in ways that I simply cannot. It's also important to establish what terms I'm going to be using to refer to the peoples who have lived on this land since before Europeans settled here, and then the terms for people who descend from those Europeans. Indigenous with a capital I is generally considered the best term at the moment for the first group of people. Native is a term that should not be used by settlers, though it may be used by Indigenous people among themselves, and Aboriginal is recognized as outdated at this point. But language changes, so Indigenous might not be the best term in a few years. Where possible, it's always best to be more specific. If you're talking about experiences that are unique to First Nations people and maybe aren't shared by Métis or Inuit, just say First Nations, or better yet, if you're talking about a specific people or nation, use that nation's name. Indigenous peoples are not monolithic. I mainly use the term Indigenous here because I'm talking about the oppression of so many peoples, and much of what I'm talking about was experienced on a wide scale, not limited to any one nation or even group of nations. It's important to note that Métis and Inuit experiences could differ from First Nations experiences in these matters because of legal distinctions or geography. However, all three groups within the category of Indigenous were treated as part of the same Indian problem. Also note that Indian is a racist and outdated term, though it is still used in legal contexts, for instance when referring to Indian status or the Indian Act, so when I use it, that's why. There's also the matter of how to refer to those of us, myself included, who descend from the Europeans who settled on this land. In my program, we tend to just go with the word settler, and that's what I prefer to do. I know a lot of people bristle at being called settlers because they feel like the term is an accusation in itself, and because they themselves probably didn't choose to settle on this land and were simply born here. To that I would say that the term is certainly not an accusation, it's simply a way of accounting for our position on this land in relation to others. Because depending on our background, we unfortunately all experience living in Canada differently, and some of us have privileges that others do not. To quote the wonderful Chelsea Vowell, who devotes a whole chapter in her book Indigenous Rights to this issue that I'd highly recommend, quote, "Sometimes we need to talk about our history and our present in ways that highlight how the differences between the many groups of peoples living in Canada have actual impacts on our lives," end quote. She points out that settler is a relational term rather than a racial category. There are also people who live on this land who are not settlers and not Indigenous, of course. I'm using the term settler mostly because that's what I am, and that's who I want to primarily address with this podcast, and because these two groups are the primary ones involved in the dynamics I'm talking about. Keep that in mind as we move forward here, and please try to keep an open mind. So to start with, let's talk about residential schools. If you're from my generation, you would have learned about them in school, but if you went to school prior to the mid-2000s, you probably didn't. Maybe you're more familiar with them from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was in the headlines a lot in the early to mid-2010s, and I should note that the TRC's executive summary is an excellent resource if you want to learn more about the schools. Residential schools were institutions where Indigenous children were sent en masse from just after Confederation up until about the 1970s, with the last school officially closing in 1996. As the name suggests, children would live at the schools, and the intention behind the schools was to separate Indigenous children from their cultures, civilize them, Christianize them, and mold them into Canadians. After a few church-run experiments in residential schooling throughout the 19th century, and looking to the established American model of Indian boarding schools, the residential school system was formed in the last decades of the 19th century. The schools were funded by the federal government and run by churches. The residential school system emerged out of a racist ideology in which Indigenous nations and cultures were held to be savage and inferior, and Indigenous parents deviant and incapable of raising their children themselves. The schools were chronically underfunded and overcrowded, and so they were breeding grounds for disease, leading to the deaths of at least 6,000 children, meaning one's odds of dying in a residential school were equivalent to one's odds of dying as a soldier in the Second World War. This was known to administrators and government officials who did nothing. The now infamous Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, was once quoted as saying, quote, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem." Unquote. Physical abuse was rife, children were beaten for speaking their languages, and sexual abuse was common too. Siblings were often separated within the schools. In his essay on the sensory experience of residential schools, Stalo scholar Dylan Robinson wrote that, quote, "With the segregation between boys and girls, and between different ages, residential schools regulated contact and the haptic intimacy of touch between siblings, thus weakening bonds of kinship. The removal of daily acts of kinship and love were replaced with those of control, separation, and censorship." Unquote. It is impossible to convey the devastation these schools caused for Indigenous children, families, and nations. Children came out of the schools deeply traumatized and isolated, having been deprived of loving relationships with parental figures and kin, and having lost their sense of cultural identity, with a learned sense of shame in their indigeneity. The quality of education at the schools was abysmal, too, so in many cases, children graduated from the schools no better equipped to enter Canadian society than when they started. Sometimes they even lacked proficiency in either English or their own language, and so were not fluent in any language. And without having had parental role models in childhood, residential school survivors often struggled to parent their own children. Then, after the Second World War, notions of welfare and citizenship in Canada shifted, which in turn brought about shifts in Indian policy and the nature of the state's intervention into Indigenous families. In 1966, the Canada Assistance Plan transferred responsibility for child welfare from federal to provincial control and introduced federal funding transfers, which allowed the provinces to invest more resources into child welfare. Thus, the child welfare system came to supersede residential schools at this time, and the number of Indigenous children apprehended into the system exploded, until by the 1970s 1 in every 3 First Nations children was in foster care or had been adopted. This process is known today as the 60s scoop, a term coined by a longtime employee of the Ministry of Human Resources in BC, who researcher Patrick Johnson wrote in 1983, quote, "admitted that provincial social workers would, quite literally, scoop children from reserves on the slightest pretext. She also made it clear, however, that she and her colleagues sincerely believed that what they were doing was in the best interests of the children. They felt that the apprehension of Indian children from reserves would save them from the effects of crushing poverty, unsanitary health conditions, poor housing, and malnutrition, which were facts of life on many reserves." Unquote. Between 1960 and 1985, at least 11,123 First Nations children were apprehended and adopted out into mostly non-Indigenous homes in Canada, in the United States, and even in other countries. It's important to note that this number is based on the Department of Indian Affairs statistics and only accounts for children who had Indian status under the Indian Act. The number is likely much higher when First Nations children who did not have Indian status under the Indian Act are included. It also does not include Métis. Alison Stevenson, a Métis scholar who is herself a 60s Scoop adoptee, puts it eloquently in her study of the Scoop in Saskatchewan. Quote, "Indigenous transracial adoption, or the intimate integration of Indigenous children in settler families, reflected newly emerging technologies to substitute Indigenous affective ties with those bound to Euro-Canadian lifeways and nation. Whereas First Nations peoples had been subject to legal and geographic separation, this integration sought to selectively eliminate such boundaries and thereby eliminate Indigenous subjectivities, kinship, and nations." Unquote. The white patriarchal nuclear family now, rather than the residential school, was the vehicle by which Indigenous children would be prepared for absorption into the Canadian citizenry. It is difficult to quantify how many children were taken in the scoop, and it varied by province, but the statistics are horrifying. In Manitoba, in 1979, provincial officials estimated that 600 to 700 Status First Nations children were taken into care each month. In British Columbia, in 1955, Indigenous children made up less than 1% of all children in care, but by 1964, less than 10 years later, they made up a third of all children in care. It's important to note, as Chelsea Vowell puts it, that the 60 Scoop is, quote, not a specific policy, but rather a series of outcomes of various child welfare practices, unquote. It was not planned centrally by the federal government, but was enabled by changes in legislation that allowed social workers to intervene directly on reserves, which Suzanne Fournier and Ernie Cray argue, quote, provided a ready-made industry for eager social work professionals who needed employment, unquote. Accounts of what ensued on reserves are disturbing. In Fournier and Cray's book, a former BC district superintendent recalled a weekend when a social worker chartered a bus to apprehend 38 children from Spletcheen First Nation. By 1970, at least 60 Spletcheen children were in permanent care, and an unknown number had already been adopted out. At times, there were fewer than 14 children left on the reserve, and the adults and elders left behind often resorted to drinking in their despair. Some children taken in the scoop were lucky enough to be adopted into loving homes, though they still felt a profound sense of loss over the severing of their ties to their birth families. In a beautiful NFB documentary, Birth of a Family, adoptee Betty Ann Adams says, quote, I was raised in a good and decent home, and I've had many people say to me, well, you were lucky. Do you think you'd be where you are now if you hadn't been taken from your mother? It's almost as if they want me to agree that I'm better off because I wasn't with my mother. And there was a time in my life when I would have agreed, but I don't feel that way now. And this isn't a comment about my family who raised me. This is a comment about my reality of my life, of me as an individual and as an Aboriginal person. And now I don't feel like I'm lucky. I feel like I've been ripped off, unquote. Other children were placed in dangerous, abusive situations. Mary Longman, a Plains Cree artist, was apprehended at the same time as her 7 siblings and then separated from them and placed into a home where she was beaten, sexually abused, and treated as a servant. Other children were bounced around between homes so many times that they were numbed to love and lost any sense of identity and place. This was the case for Richard Cardinal, a Métis boy who too was removed from his family, separated from his siblings, and placed in 28 different living situations, 16 foster homes and 12 group homes and locked facilities, in addition to time spent on the street trying to escape abuse, before he took his own life at age 17. Fournier and Cray point out that in residential schools, terrible as they were, children always knew their First Nation and who their parents were and knew that they would eventually get to go home. This was not the case for foster and adopted children in the 60s Scoop, for whom finding this information can be extremely difficult or simply impossible. In 1982, an inquiry was held into the child welfare system. The head of the inquiry, Edwin C. Kimmelman, condemned the system and wrote that, quote, it would be reassuring if blame could be laid to any single part of the system. The appalling reality is that everyone involved believed they were doing their best and stood firm in their beliefs that the system was working well. The miracle is that there were not more children lost in the system run by so many well-intentioned people. The road to hell was paved with good intentions, and the child welfare system was the paving contractor, unquote. Though Kimmelman's inquiry led to public outcry and some legislative changes, many argue that the 60s Scoop has only morphed into the Millennial Scoop, now with more Indigenous social workers recruited to do the scooping. More broadly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that today's child welfare system, quote, has simply continued the assimilation that the residential school system started, unquote. So what does this child welfare crisis look like in the 21st century? First, the numbers. Data from Indian Affairs Canada, or INAC, showed that between 1995 and 2001, the number of First Nations children in child welfare care on reserve increased by 71.5%. There are more First Nations children in welfare care today than there were in residential schools at their height, by a factor of 3. In 2006, Indigenous children made up between 40 and 60% of the children in state care in Canada, while Indigenous peoples comprise only 3.8% of the population of Canada. In Alberta, Indigenous children represent 59% of the children in care. In BC, they represent 64% of the children in care, but only 10% of the population under 19 years of age. And in Manitoba, Indigenous children represent a whopping 90% of the children in care under 15 years of age. Collectively, between 1989 and 2012, First Nations children have spent over 60 million nights, which add up to 180,000 years, in foster care. It is important to note that these numbers do not reflect any sort of inherent parenting deficiencies on the part of Indigenous peoples. Some Indigenous parents may experience difficulties with raising their children in ways that settler parents generally do not. They may be carrying a lot of intergenerational trauma themselves that can lead to addictions. Their own parents may have struggled to raise and show affection to their children as a result of their experiences in residential schools. They are more likely to be food insecure, and they are more likely to live in poor and overcrowded housing. It is crucial, however, to acknowledge that these are challenges that have been created by settler colonialism, and are reflective of human needs not being met by a government that today is at best indifferent and at worst hostile towards Indigenous families. When looking at the reasons children are removed from their families, these difficulties are reflected under the maltreatment category of neglect. Neglect is the most cited reason for substantiated child maltreatment investigations of First Nations families, accounting for 46% of such investigations. There are significantly lower rates of physical abuse among First Nations families compared with non-First Nations families. 9% of investigations of First Nations families compared with 23% of non-First Nations families, in addition to slightly lower rates of sexual abuse and intimate partner violence compared with non-First Nations families, and equal rates of emotional maltreatment. Dr. Cindy Blackstock, professor of social work right here at McGill, member of the Gitxsan First Nation and executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, points out that these rates suggest that, quote, First Nations children were not being removed because their families are putting them at greater risk, but rather because their families are at greater risk due to social exclusion, poverty, and poor housing, unquote. In 2007, the Assembly of First Nations, or AFN, joined together with the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, which I will refer to from here on out simply as the Caring Society, to file a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission alleging that the federal government, through the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, or INAC, had discriminated against First Nations children on reserve by providing inequitable child welfare services and failed to properly implement Jordan's Principle, a child-first response to jurisdictional disputes between the federal and provincial governments requiring the government of first contact to fund services to First Nations children, including for health and educational needs. Just to fill you in, because I think everyone should be familiar with it, this principle is named for Jordan River Anderson of the Norway House Cree Nation, a little boy with special needs who needed hospital care for the first 2 years of his life. Jordan had eventually been given the go-ahead by doctors to leave the hospital, but a dispute between the federal government and the government of Manitoba over who would fund his in-home care kept him in the hospital for 3 more years. He died after falling into a coma at age 5, never having gotten to go home. Had he not been Indigenous, he would have gone home without delay. Cindy Blackstock was the face of the proceedings before the Human Rights Tribunal, fighting these injustices for years as INAC attempted to have the case thrown out over technicalities, and it is no exaggeration to say that Canada fought the Caring Society with all it had. Not even 30 days after filing the case, the Caring Society found out the government had cut their core funding, and it cut the rest of their funding over the following months. They were forced to constantly fundraise in order to pay over $250,000 in legal fees to counsel and use their personal air miles to travel to the hearings. On one occasion in late 2009, Dr. Blackstock was invited by the Chiefs of Ontario to attend a meeting at INAC headquarters. When she arrived, she was barred from entering the meeting room by a senior INAC official, and then guarded by a security guard as she voluntarily waited outside despite her professional conduct. After this incident, Dr. Blackstock filed a request under the Privacy Act for records about herself held by INAC. When she was given the records in 2011, she discovered that INAC and the Department of Justice had deployed at least 189 public servants to surveil her movements and online postings, to try to find ulterior motives on her part for filing the case so that they could have it dismissed on frivolous or vexatious grounds. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner found that Dr. Blackstock's privacy had been violated, and the tribunal found in 2015 that INAC had recklessly and willfully retaliated against her by blocking her participation in the Chiefs of Ontario meeting. These findings drew international attention. Canada's conduct in these cases was investigated by the United Nations. Despite INAC's best efforts, however, on January 26, 2016, almost 9 years after the case was filed, the tribunal found the Government of Canada's inequitable provision of child welfare services to Indigenous children to be discriminatory on the prohibited grounds of race and national or ethnic origin. Throughout this long process, the number of INAC employees increased by 13%, and its legal fees of at least $8 million were fully subsidized by the public. Dr. Blackstock reminds us that this public money fueled, quote, a plethora of legal, illegal, and procedural tactics, unquote, on INAC's part to attempt to get the case thrown out. INAC's despicable actions in the tribunal case prove in no uncertain terms that Canada is invested in preserving the status quo in Indigenous child welfare. Why is this? What are the government's motivations for fighting change? And what deeper systemic problems make the status quo so dangerous? It's not an issue of money. Dr. Blackstock points out, in the long run, ending child welfare inequities could save Canadian taxpayers billions of dollars, since healthy, happy children are less likely to require public services and more likely to contribute to the economy as adults. Deeply ingrained negative perceptions of Indigenous peoples inherent in the system and held by individuals may play a part too. Sarah DeLue, Margot Greenwood, and Emily Cameron argue that these perceptions, quote, were and are produced and perpetuated through texts, legislations, government policies, and acts of state that reproduce, rely on, and perpetuate understandings of deviance, particularly mental health and addiction deviance, in Indigenous peoples. These discourses simultaneously produce non-Indigenous peoples as legitimate and necessary agents of care, protection, and improvement, unquote. We must interrogate why it is we assume that the federal government and courts have the best interests of Indigenous children in mind. DeLu and her co-authors argue, citing anthropologist Tanya Murray Lee, that this, quote, construction of non-Indigenous governments and other agencies as helping, protecting, and benevolent forces aiming to improve and transform Indigenous peoples for their own good is not only a crucial colonial strategy with remarkable tenacity, it also offers a means for colonizers to distance themselves from more obviously coercive, violent, or colonial ideas, actions, and policies, unquote. Part of the problem also lies in the conflicting differences between European, Canadian, and Indigenous worldviews, an issue which manifests itself in several ways. When settler social workers go to Indigenous homes, what they see may be at odds with their vision of a safe home. Métis social work professor Kathy Richardson and her co-author Bill Nelson point out that children may participate in activities considered by settlers to be unsafe, neglectful, or inappropriate for children, such as fishing, carving, walking home from school or playing outside unattended, missing school to attend ceremonies, or sharing rooms with multiple siblings. Cupboards and freezers in homes on reserve may contain wild meat and berries rather than store-bought foods that look more familiar to non-Indigenous eyes. Looking more broadly, non-Indigenous social workers may not include communal cultural concerns in their evaluation of the best interests of the child. Alison Stevenson argues that Canada is an individualistic liberal order built on the primacy of liberty, equality, and private property, where Indigenous nations are more concerned with kinship, relationality, and mutual obligation not just between humans, but also with the ancestors, the land, and other living things. Judges and social workers do not always weigh the importance of culture and connectivity in an Indigenous child's upbringing when they make decisions about apprehension, and legislation on these matters can differ vastly from province to province. But much is at stake when an Indigenous child is removed from home, for both the child and for their nation. Cindy Blackstock recounts the response of a friend and mentor of hers from the Nisga'a Nation to a question about why his people needed their own child welfare agency. Quote, "There's only a few hundred Nisga'a children left in the world today. We can't afford to leave even one. Our languages aren't spoken in other parts of the world. We can't go visit other peoples to regain what is lost from us. We need these kids to be raised at home, in their languages, because fundamentally what's at stake is the survival of our peoples," unquote. This leads me to another point. Though the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's finding of discrimination was a huge victory for First Nations children, I think racial discrimination is not a full enough descriptor of what Indigenous children face in the child welfare system. Unlike people of other ethnic backgrounds in Canada, Indigenous peoples are from nations that predate Canada and claim the same lands. This means that when Indigenous children are separated from their families and cultures and abused within the welfare system, not only do the individual children themselves suffer, but their nations are weakened. The system sweeps Indigenous children into cycles of poverty and despair, and they lose their sense of identity. And building off a point that the late Arthur Manuel makes in his incredible book, The Reconciliation Manifesto, people who don't have a strong sense of identity, who suffer from mental illness, and who live in dire poverty are much less likely to have the energy and resources to fight for their nation's self-determination and for the rights to their land. So ultimately, it is in the government of Canada's interests to keep Indigenous peoples in poverty if it wants to be able to continue with its reckless resource extraction unabated. And part of that entails keeping firm control over Indigenous children and allowing them to languish in foster care. I realize this is a very dark-sounding perspective that might be alarming to some. To be clear, I'm not saying that the people at INAC sat down before appearing in front of the Human Rights Tribunal and said out loud to each other, okay, we have to allow these kids to keep suffering so they don't grow up to take our land. But at the very least, I absolutely think that they are conscious that if they grant Indigenous peoples more control over their children, and actually work to fix the horrific and all too often deadly current situation that so many children find themselves in now, the road will be paved for future calls to action from Indigenous peoples that inevitably will include matters of land. Again, I know it sounds harsh, but Canada puts resource extraction over Indigenous lives every single day, as it is. You need only look to all the communities with poisoned water or contaminated air, or at the uptick in violence against Indigenous women when man camps come to reserves to build pipelines. I think the most horrifying thing about it is that this violence is embedded in our system, that it is the status quo at this point. The vast majority of settlers inside and outside the government aren't sitting around scheming about doing terrible things to Indigenous peoples, but that is what our systems do, and if left unchallenged, they will continue to do it. Us, as individual settlers knowing it's wrong, isn't enough. So far, we've mostly looked at the child welfare system from the outside and discussed the factors that built the system as we know it today. Now I want to look closer at how the system functions, at the experiences children have in care, and what life looks like for them when they leave care. And I also want to explain what I mean when I refer to the cycles of poverty and despair that the system creates. To start with, let's look at funding. The detailed economic analysis in the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society's 2005 Wende report revealed that funding for First Nations child welfare, which comes from the federal government, was about 30% lower than funding for non-Indigenous children in care, which is provided by the provincial governments. In Ontario alone, the 3 First Nations-run child and family service agencies in the north were underfunded by $500 million between 2012 and 2017. In a report by APTN, Dr. Kim Snow of Ryerson University compares the Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society in southern Ontario, which had had an average of 613 kids in care in 2013 and was allocated $56 million by the Government of Ontario, and Dilico Anishinaabeg Family Care, which serves a massive area containing 13 nations around Thunder Bay, had an average of 583 kids in care in 2013 and was allocated only $26 million. That's a $30 million difference, and not that big a difference in the number of kids. And even as the number of children in care in Windsor went down, its funding continued to increase, while at Dilico the number of kids stayed the same over 4 years, but they barely received any more funding in that time. Dilico was underfunded approximately $137 million in 5 years. First Nations-run child and family service agencies are underfunded and strained to a point where in many cases apprehension is the only affordable option in welfare cases that with much more funding could be better attended to with other supports. Before she worked at the Caring Society, Cindy Blackstock was a social worker in BC in the 1980s and 90s. She first worked for a provincial agency where she says, quote, "There was a very well-developed array of specialized services within government and voluntary sector services, such as food banks, low-income housing, child development supports, parenting programs, family recreation, and mental health services," unquote, which meant that their child removal rates were very low. She then took a position at a Squamish First Nation welfare agency funded by the federal government, which lacked even the basics like medical equipment and support services for children in care, and was housed in an unsafe building. She says her workload dramatically increased, and, quote, "Negotiating with federal officials to access basic services for children took up a significant amount of time, and I often gave up in frustration because the child could not wait for the service. I therefore ended up paying for the service personally or held fundraisers to compensate for systemic shortcomings in funding. All too often it was impossible to meet the children's needs, no matter how dire or urgent their situation," unquote. Not only does this funding situation lead to more apprehensions, but the strain on staff and the lack of resources can make eventual family unification, once a child is in the system, harder to come by. High caseloads for social workers and staff turnover at welfare agencies have been shown to have negative effects on reunification and permanency outcomes. One study found that children in care who had only one caseworker, something you'd see in a situation where the welfare agency is well funded, have reunification and permanency rates of 74.5%. In cases where 2 workers were involved, something you'd see at underfunded agencies with high staff turnover, reunification and permanency rates dropped to only 17.5%. Even after the Human Rights Tribunal finding and 5 subsequent non-compliance orders to the federal government from the tribunal, the increase in funding in the federal budget was not enough. This leads me to another issue, the lack of stability in living arrangements for children in care. You may recall Richard Cardinal's story, which I mentioned earlier, 28 different living situations in 14 years. Richard was a child of the 60s scoop, but in many cases children still have to deal with constantly being shuffled between foster homes, group homes, and even hotels. The average Indigenous child in care will live with between 3 and 13 families before the age of 19. Kathy Richardson and Bill Nelson write that with this instability, quote, "Love becomes something elusive while children become experts at emotionally distancing themselves from each new set of temporary caregivers," unquote. There is also, of course, the question of whether transracial adoption and fostering is ethical in the first place. To be clear, I'm not saying that all non-Indigenous people who adopt Indigenous children are malicious or racist. Many, of course, are incredibly well-intentioned and loving and do provide their foster or adoptive children with stability. But I do want to look at the evidence of harms arising from transracial care because these harms do exist. This is not something that gets a lot of attention from the government or courts. The ruling in the Racine v. Woods case of 1983, which implied that the importance of a child's cultural heritage diminishes over time as their bond with their foster family grows, is still followed in many cases. According to social worker Raven Sinclair, there is no evidence that bonding and attachment increase with time in transracial adoption, but the literature does indicate that the significance of cultural heritage increases with time for Indigenous foster children and adoptees. Besides this, it is difficult for children in non-Indigenous homes to learn what Heath Fogg Davis, author of The Ethics of Transracial Adoption, calls racial navigation, the skill of navigating the world as a racialized person that is normally picked up from observing parents and community members in same-race contexts. Métis social worker Janine Carrière describes the importance of connectedness in adoption, which she defines as a child's sense of belonging and being an important part of the world. Adoption can create what she calls spiritual dissonance. The child grows up in a world in which they feel that they are in some way different, and they, quote, retain a permeating sense of loss despite a relatively nurturing adoptive home environment, unquote. In an article co-authored with Kathy Richardson, she outlines the existing literature on transracial adoption of Indigenous children, citing authors who emphasize the importance of cultural continuity in child health and as a preventative factor in the risk of youth suicide, as well as the importance of kinship bonds and communal Indigenous life in a child's emotional well-being. I fear that we settlers often see Indigenous culture as performance, as singing and dancing, which can be done anywhere, like at urban powwows. Without subtracting from the significance of these cultural forms, it's important to note that culture is much more expansive than just these aspects, and that's something I've learned a lot about in Indigenous studies at McGill. Culture is not limited to public forms of ceremony. It is everyday life. It is interactions between generations at home and out on the land. It's harvesting and eating foods that once people has been harvesting and eating for thousands of years. It's storytelling. It's language. These are not things for which there are easy substitutes when children are taken off reserves and sent to cities or other faraway locations. Most importantly, culture is kinship, and no matter how many powwows a white urban foster family takes an Indigenous child to, something will be missing if they do not maintain a strong connection with their home nation and do not experience the belonging of kinship. Indeed, research has shown that Indigenous children in foster or adoptive families experience greater wellness when they maintain a connection to their natural families, and this is a human right they have under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Finally, conditions for children in the system and outcomes for young adults coming out of the system are deeply troubling. Children are in many cases still placed with foster parents who harbor prejudices towards Indigenous peoples, which can cause those kids to internalize self-hatred from a young age, or foster families may try to stop children from learning more about their cultures and birth families. Dylan Cohen, a young Métis community organizer, was placed with a white Christian family, and he recounts that, quote, "When I looked into my ancestry and when I was showing more interest, they told me to stop trying to game the system. They held a lot of racist perspectives about Indigenous people. That was the environment that I would come into my identity in," unquote. Some are placed in homes where there is physical or sexual abuse. You may recall the murder of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine, which was in the headlines in the mid-2010s. Tina ran away from her placement in a hotel after a second girl who lived at the hotel was viciously sexually assaulted by another resident. When Jay Simpson, an Ojibwe poet and two-spirit person, asked to be removed from their abusive placement as a child, they were told that their only options were placement in a group home or in one of those temporary hotels. Dylan Cohen, too, was told that he and his sister could not be taken out of their abusive placement. In his words, quote, "The best scenario for the social workers was some trauma for us," unquote. Manitoba's First Nations family advocate, Cora Morgan, recounts a horrifying story of one woman who had been raised in such an abusive situation. Quote, "One of the mothers that I worked with, she was committed to making sure that CFS did not touch her children as she aged out of the system. From the time she was 12 years old until she was 18 in this child welfare system, she was given one dress, one pair of panties, one pair of pantyhose, a pair of shoes. She was given 4 items from 12 to 18, and to make ends meet and survive, she was exploited, just to survive," unquote. According to Morgan, 70% of missing persons in Manitoba in 2016 and 17 were girls who had been in the child welfare system. 89% of children who have never been in care graduate high school, while only 33.4% of children in care can expect to graduate. Youth in care are more likely to get pregnant in adolescence, to struggle with alcohol and drugs, and to be unhoused as adults, and they are 4.5 times more likely to die preventable deaths than those not in care. In Alberta, 78% of children who died in foster care between 1999 and 2013 were Indigenous. This is an even more disproportionate rate than the rate of Indigenous child apprehension in the province. 1 child in the Alberta child welfare system dies per week, including non-Indigenous children. In Ontario, 1 child in the system dies every 3 days, and the situation is worsening with Premier Ford's cuts. Also recall the underfunded agencies in Northern Ontario I was discussing earlier. 102 Indigenous children connected to child welfare in Northern Ontario died between 2013 and 2017, and almost half of those deaths took place in the 2 years it took for Prime Minister Trudeau to respond to the Human Rights Tribunal's non-compliance orders. Cindy Blackstock has this to say about those deaths. Quote, "Children died waiting for Canada. That's the problem with them saying, oh well, we are making good first steps, be patient with us. The reality is that children's lives are really on the line while we're waiting, and many more children lost their lives during the time we litigated this case and for the many years before when they had a chance to fix it," unquote. So I hope it is evident at this point that things need to change, and that's the last thing I want to talk about today. How do we fix this? How do we ensure that all Indigenous children have their basic human rights protected and that Indigenous families and nations are kept together? To start with, let's talk about the kinds of programs that could replace the existing foster care system. Obviously, apprehension is necessary in some cases because, in some cases, it is genuinely unsafe for children to live with their birth parents. But as we discussed earlier, neglect is the main reason children are being removed from their families, not abuse, which points to the need for more comprehensive, holistic, and preventative care as the main solution to this problem. There are already models for these kinds of programs. One is the Live-In Family Enhancement or LIFE program offered by Métis Child, Family, and Community Services in Manitoba. In this program, the entire family, not just the children, is placed full-time in a foster home with a family mentor, where they are given access to a range of supports including sharing circles, counseling, parenting training, anger management training, substance abuse relapse prevention programs, employment assistance, and support with budgeting, nutrition, and issues at school or daycare. The outcomes of this program when it ran for the first time with families preparing for reunification were very positive. According to an evaluation of the program by Lawrence Dean and his co-authors, staff and participants described how parents were able to establish predictable routines, develop their self-esteem and parenting skills, build trust in the welfare agency, and create strong and lasting relationships with their mentors, broaden their support circles and repair relationships with estranged family members and friends, learn how to manage a household, and obtain secure housing and income. All of this was achieved by redirecting the annual funding that would normally go towards paying foster families, so it did not cost any more than was already being paid for foster care. Programs like this could make a huge difference for families, if not just used for reunification, but for earlier preventative interventions too. You may also recall the story of the Splatcheen First Nation, who saw busloads of their children taken away in the 60s scoop, which I mentioned earlier. Today, the Splatcheen have the only First Nation child welfare service in BC that exists entirely outside the provincial system. They have jurisdiction over their children on and off reserve, and they know where every single child is. Their service has made a huge difference in the lives of Splatcheen children. Sarah Thomas assumed guardianship of her 3 nieces when her sister was no longer able to care for them, and she received $750 more per month for their care than she would have if she had called BC's Ministry of Social Development for help instead. Throughout their 8 years living with her, Sarah's nieces only had 2 social workers who were always available to them for whatever they needed, even once they'd officially aged out of care. When Splatcheen children need to be removed from their parents' homes, efforts are made to ensure that these children have contact with their parents where possible and maintain relationships with other family members. In urban centers, community hubs housing multiple services for families could be a solution, like Our Place in Vancouver's downtown east side, where local families can access healthcare, after-school programs, parenting classes, recreation programs, and free meals all in one place, without having to travel across the city. Other programs and groups formed at the community level set excellent examples in improving the lives of children already in care. One such group is the Nagansichik Grandmothers, apologies for my pronunciation, made up of matriarchs of the 9 tribes of Lukwalam's on the northwest coast of British Columbia. The grandmothers have supported all Lukwalam's children in care since 2010 in a variety of ways. They invite the children along with their social workers and caregivers to visit their home communities, meet their extended families, and learn traditional skills like seaweed gathering. They send personal cards and gifts to each child who lives away from their home territory, and they keep in touch with these children via Skype. In 2005, they welcomed 29 children home to meet their extended families, clothing them each with a traditional vest to, quote, remind them where they belong and that they would never be forgotten. Tears were shed at this moment, as we believe it instilled that true sense of belonging, unquote. After discussions with the grandmothers, the Lukwalam's Band Council made the decision to no longer allow any of their children to be adopted out to non-Indigenous families. The grandmothers make sure that none of their children ever wonder who they are, like so many children of the 60s scoop did their entire lives, and many still do today. In their words, quote, our communities have a lot to offer about Indigenous knowledge and ways of being, and we know that honoring these children and youth in these very practical ways shows respect for who they are and builds their sense of cultural identity and pride, unquote. Importantly, all these things that I've discussed are community-run programs. While the federal government can and should provide funding, future alternative family programs must be developed and directed by Indigenous peoples who know what is best for their children and must be able to care for their children in culturally appropriate ways that strengthen their nations. Wider-scale systemic change needs to happen too at all levels of government and in schools of social work, and new legislation on child welfare on its own will not be enough. For these problems to truly be solved, we need to rethink Canada completely and put an end to colonialism once and for all. Arthur Manuel often argued that we need to develop something of an Indigenous New Deal, and Cindy Blackstock wants to see something akin to the Marshall Plan developed to totally shift Indigenous Canadian relations through legislation. This would mean replacing the shameful Indian Act, which still shapes those relations today, and granting self-determination to Indigenous nations. It would also mean negotiations over the return of land and a renewed commitment on Canada's part to its existing treaty obligations. Unfortunately, there's no reason to expect anything like this to happen anytime soon. In the meantime, the most important thing for improving child welfare is funding. Funding gaps must be closed for any other significant change to happen. Luckily, numerous inquiries and reports, such as the Caring Society's incredibly detailed one-day report, have already prescribed for the federal government exactly what it needs to do to close those gaps. Infuriatingly, as Dr. Blackstock points out, quote, the tribunal found that the federal government have repeatedly been made aware of the inequalities and harms to kids, repeatedly been presented with solutions and chose not to implement those solutions, unquote. So to be clear, while the bad news is that the government has refused so far to implement them, the good news is that these solutions do already exist. This can be said of what we call reconciliation as a whole. So many different commissions and inquiries have already laid out hundreds of recommendations and calls to action that all levels of government and other institutions in Canadian society can take to get the reconciliation ball rolling, such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the older Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, all the reports of inquests into the wrongful deaths of Indigenous children and other injustices. So if you're a settler and you want to be an ally to Indigenous peoples and fight for justice in your own life, you may be wondering, what can you do to help? To start with, I think it's important that we rethink what our responsibilities are as settlers. When I was in my first year at McGill, I read an article from my very first Indigenous Studies class that totally changed the way I thought about being a settler. The article is by Dylan Robinson, who I quoted earlier when discussing residential schools. Indigenous peoples live with intergenerational trauma rooted in experiences of residential schools, and by intergenerational, I mean that the trauma of residential schools has been passed down and is experienced not just by those who were in the schools themselves, but by their children and grandchildren too. And we talked about the different forms this trauma can take earlier in our discussion of residential schools. While virtually all Indigenous peoples experience intergenerational trauma in one form or another, most of us as settlers do not see ourselves as having any obligation to dismantle the systems our grandparents built. We did not choose to do these things, we say, so we're not responsible for them. But Indigenous people today did not choose for their grandparents to go to residential school either, yet they still have to live with the consequences of that history every single day. Discussing what conciliation might entail, Robinson argues, quote, requires a much larger reconsideration of what words settler Canadians might use to acknowledge their intergenerational responsibility. It requires words that speak of the public's national and civic responsibility to respond in the present to a history that few have direct experience with. Most importantly, I suggest settler Canadians might consider using a phrase that names the continued ignorance of Indigenous histories and the lack of civic responsibility for what it is, intergenerational perpetration, unquote. Indigenous individuals who fight for their rights and who fight to protect their land often dislike being labeled as activists because they did not choose those causes. They are compelled by their devotion to their people, to their land, and to every other living thing to fight and fundamentally to ensure the survival of these things. So even though we didn't choose to take part in colonialism, we as settlers benefit from colonialism every single day, and we must take action. As Raven Sinclair points out, quote, white privilege and racial prejudice persist unabatedly in racialized societies because those who benefit from that normative racial advantage, often based on racial biases and ethnocentrism, have no cause to interrogate their own systemic/institutionalized privilege or racism, and hence no cause to engage in any actions that would counter it, unquote. With all that being said, what should settlers do? We should look at child welfare in a big picture way that accounts for all the other harms of colonialism. A good first step is to get informed in general. Learn whose lands you're living on, what languages are spoken on that land, and which treaties govern that land. Read about the worldviews and histories of the peoples whose lands you live on. Read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to learn the history of residential schools. Read non-fiction books by brilliant Indigenous authors like Chelsea Vowell, Lee Maracle, Maria Campbell, and Arthur Manuel. Read fiction books by brilliant Indigenous authors like Richard Wagamese, Eden Robinson, and Thomas King. Watch and support Indigenous media. Documentaries are a really excellent and immersive way of learning about other people's experiences. The National Film Board's website has all kinds of documentaries on Indigenous issues and cultures that are absolutely free, and APTN on YouTube and cable television is an invaluable resource for that kind of thing as well. Educate other settlers around you with what you've learned, and challenge racism when you hear it coming from your relatives and friends and neighbors. Contact your MPs about issues that concern you in specific legislation. Show up to protests and rallies. Donate regularly to mutual aid funds and organizations doing crucial work on the ground, especially those in your area. For child welfare specifically, donate to the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Remember that they get no government funding because they stood up for children at the Human Rights Tribunal, and recall the incredible work they've done. If you're a parent, raise your child to be actively anti-racist. Take them to powwows. One thing I didn't know until I came to McGill is that everybody is welcome at most powwows, including non-Indigenous people, and they can be a wonderful opportunity to acquaint your child with Indigenous cultures from a young age. Be respectful and follow powwow etiquette, and you'll have an amazing time. Read your child books by Indigenous authors. Get to know the Caring Society. They have lots of ways for kids to get engaged. In fact, it was kids of all ages and all backgrounds who ensured that the Human Rights Tribunal case was covered when they showed up in shifts to watch the hearings as part of the Caring Society's I Am a Witness program. They wrote to the government and they refused to stay silent about the injustice they saw so clearly. And the Caring Society has an adorable teddy bear representative, Spirit Bear, who went to all the tribunal hearings and whose adventures kids can follow through gorgeous picture books about the tribunal case and more. Spirit Bear even has an animated movie, Spirit Bear and Children Make History. Take advantage of these resources and empower your children to make a difference for Indigenous children, because really these things won't change until all of us as settlers refuse to be silent, just as Indigenous peoples have refused to be silent for as long as settlers have been here. And a big part of that means raising a new generation of Canadian kids who refuse to accept the status quo. The amazing Cindy Blackstock wrote after the tribunal's 2016 finding that, quote, "In my lifetime, I hope to see a generation of First Nations children who can live the lives they wish to have, and a generation of non-Aboriginal children who never have to grow up to say they are sorry," unquote. We all have a part to play in bringing about a future like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast and for caring.